They thought I'd never show my face again. But how would you feel if the same family who erased you for a decade used your name to rebuild their empire? I didn't sue. I didn't scream. I just donated $2 million, anonymously, to their grand redemption gala. When the auctioneer called my foundation's name, my mother froze mid-toast. My father dropped his smile, and every camera turned. I'm Madeline Carter, and this is how I bought back my silence and their downfall. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Winter settles hard over Westchester, the kind of cold that seeps through the stone walls of a house too big for warmth. I can still hear the echo of my mother's heels clicking against the marble as she moved through the dining room, directing staff, straightening napkins that were already perfect. The Carters have never tolerated imperfection, not in table settings, not in family, especially not in me. I was 27 that year, still living in the house that raised me but no longer belonged to me. My father, Robert Carter Sr., ran Carter & Sons Construction, a name that sounded sturdy, permanent, respectable. My mother, Eleanor, ran the Carter Family Foundation, the glittering jewel she wore for charity galas and glossy magazine features. My younger sister, Ava, worked in public relations, and every photo of her radiated confidence. My brother, Michael, was still in college, blissfully untouched by the politics of reputation. That night, the family dinner stretched into ceremony. The dining room glowed with soft candlelight, reflecting off crystal and silver. My mother's voice carried easily down the long table. We've just secured a new partnership with the Healthbridge Initiative, she announced, smiling for my father's approval. The foundation's impact will double next quarter. My father nodded with the restrained pride of a man who expected success. Ava clapped her hands lightly, always eager to perform enthusiasm. I cut a piece of salmon. Said nothing at first, then asked quietly, "Are we sure all the funding's clean? The new donors? Where are they coming from?" The room froze. My father's knife stopped midair. Ava looked down, pretending to adjust her napkin. My mother's smile held for a fraction of a second before hardening into something sharp. "Of course it's clean," she said evenly. "That's a strange question to ask your family at dinner." "Madeline." "I'm not accusing," I said carefully. "I just noticed some inconsistencies in the quarterly report. Transfers that don't match the public filings." Her eyes met mine, calm and cold. "You've always had a suspicious mind. It's unbecoming." My father's voice cut in low and final. Enough talk about business at the table. The conversation shifted to Ava's new PR campaign, to Michael's midterms, to anything else. But the silence that settled between my mother and me was heavier than before. I excused myself early, claiming a headache. Later that night, the house was quiet. The staff had gone, and the only light came from the hall lamp by my father's study. I hesitated at the doorway, the memory of my mother's warning echoing in my head. Still, curiosity pushed harder than fear. I sat at his desk, breathing in the smell of leather and paper, and pulled open the top drawer. The files were meticulous. Color-coded folders printed ledgers' signatures. At first glance, everything was perfect. But beneath the surface documents were copies of wire transfers from the foundation to a shell company registered in Delaware. The amounts were enormous, labeled as consulting fees. I flipped page after page, my pulse thudding in my ears. When I looked up, my reflection in the glass of the bookcase startled me. I didn't look brave. I looked terrified. I carried the papers upstairs to my mother's suite. She was sitting at her vanity, removing her earrings. When she saw the documents in my hand, her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing with those? I found them in Dad's office. The foundation's moving money through dummy accounts. You can't tell me you didn't know." She sighed, as though I were a child interrupting her evening. "Madeline, you don't understand how this world works. It's complicated." "No," I said. "It's illegal." Her tone dropped quiet, but slicing. "What's illegal is tearing down your own family in public. Do you have any idea what would happen if this got out? Maybe people would finally see the truth." She stood suddenly inches from my face. "The truth is whatever we protect. This family doesn't survive without discretion. Your father built everything we have. You will not destroy it because you crave moral purity." "I'm not the one destroying anything," I said, my voice trembling. "You are." Her expression didn't change. "You've always been dramatic. You're too sensitive for this world. I'm trying to save you from yourself." I left before I could say more. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the documents still spread across my bed. By morning I burned the copies in the fireplace. It wasn't courage that stopped me from turning them in. It was the faint, pathetic hope that maybe she'd be right, that silence would somehow save us. 3 months later, everything collapsed. The foundation's financials leaked to the press. Investigations began. Reporters camped outside our gates. The scandal swept through New York's social circuit like wildfire. And when my mother spoke to the media, she didn't defend me. She told them I'd acted alone, that I'd misunderstood confidential information and jeopardized the family's reputation. In one statement, she erased me. By December, my name was poison. Donors withdrew, friends disappeared. My father couldn't look at me. Ava avoided me entirely. When I confronted my parents, my mother only said, "You brought this on yourself." The night they told me to leave, snow had started falling. I packed 2 suitcases. My degree, a few clothes, and the small reproduction of Portrait of Grace that used to hang in the hallway outside my bedroom. The painting of us before everything cracked. In the foyer, my mother stood by the staircase, elegant as ever, her pearls gleaming against her black dress. "You've made your choice," she said. I looked at her one last time. "No, Mother. You made it, because you can't stand the truth looking back at you." She didn't answer. I walked out into the freezing rain, the gravel crunching under my shoes. Behind me, the mansion loomed, its windows glowing warm and distant. Ahead, my car waited like a lifeline. As I drove away, the snow turned to sleet, streaking across the windshield like gray ribbons. The reproduction of our family portrait sat on the passenger seat beside me. I caught my reflection in the glass and whispered to myself, "You're on your own now." The house faded in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the storm. The first winter in Brooklyn tasted like burnt coffee and fear. My apartment was the kind of place where the walls sweated in the summer and the radiator coughed in the winter. A single window looked out over an alley filled with trash cans and fire escapes. Still, it was mine. For the first time, I didn't have to be the Carter daughter. I was just Maddie, a nobody in a city full of nobodies, trying to start over. During the day, I worked at a corner cafe near Flatbush wearing a faded apron and a name tag that read M. I served espresso to people who didn't look at me twice, and I liked it that way. Anonymity was a strange kind of peace. At night, I took the train uptown to Columbia, where I was finishing an MBA program that I paid for with student loans and every tip I made. Freedom sounds romantic until you're counting coins at midnight to decide between groceries or subway fare. I learned to live on instant noodles and leftover muffins from the cafe. My hands always smelled like coffee grounds. But every morning when I opened my eyes, and no one told me who to be, I felt something close to hope. My old life had vanished. The friends from Westchester stopped calling once the scandal hit the news. They'd smile politely if we crossed paths online, but their silence spoke louder than any words. My last name had become a warning. Carter. It meant trouble deception scandal. One night, after a 12-hour shift and a missed dinner, I stood in front of my class to deliver a presentation titled The Social Contract of Charity. My voice shook at first, but I steadied it. I talked about how philanthropy loses its soul when it becomes performance, how charity without integrity is just PR with better lighting. When I finished, the room was silent. I thought I'd gone too far, until my professor, a tall woman with silver hair and calm eyes, began to clap. After class, she stopped me in the hallway. "You see things clearly," she said. "That's rare." "Maybe too clearly," I replied. She smiled. "Clarity can be lonely, but it's also power. I'm Linda Rowe." She handed me her card. "I'm working on a study about nonprofit transparency for the Rowe Institute. I could use a research assistant." I stared at the card for a long moment. "You know my last name, right?" "I do," she said simply. "I also know you understand failure better than most people. That makes you valuable." That was how I met the first person who didn't treat me like a liability. Linda's office sat in a converted warehouse in Soho, lined with books about ethics, economics, and human behavior. She put me to work immediately, analyzing grant structures, reading case studies, learning what made organizations honest or corrupt. For the first time since I left home, I felt useful. Days blurred into nights. I'd spend hours at her desk reviewing budgets, mapping impact models, drinking too much coffee. Linda wasn't gentle, but she was fair. "Never build something on sand," she'd say. "Even if no one's watching, the foundation has to hold." Working with her changed me. She saw through the guilt I carried, the quiet anger I tried to hide. "You don't have to redeem your family, Maddie," she told me one afternoon as we walked through Washington Square Park. "You just have to do better than they did." I threw myself into the work, Linda introduced me to small business owners and community leaders who wanted to help but didn't trust the system anymore. We visited crowded schools and food pantries, places that survived on faith more than funding, listening to their stories. I realized how deeply people wanted to believe in something real. Still, reminders of who I used to be crept in. At a networking event, when I introduced myself as Maddie Carter, a potential donor tilted his head. Carter. As in the Westchester Carters. I froze for a second before forcing a smile. Just a common name, I said. He nodded, but the look in his eyes said he didn't buy it. A week later, I applied for a small city grant to expand our research. The application asked for institutional sponsors. I had none. Without a reputable organization backing me, my proposal was rejected within days. I stared at the rejection email. Heart pounding. I had done everything right, worked hard, told the truth, asked for nothing dishonest. Still, my last name carried a shadow I couldn't outrun. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment watching the streetlights flicker across the wet pavement. I whispered, I understand now, what it feels like to be erased. There was no bitterness in the words, only recognition. I'd been removed from every list that mattered. Family privilege, even credibility. But sometimes absence gives you room to build something of your own. By spring of 2018, Linda and I finished our research project. On a rainy Tuesday, we presented it to a small group of local business owners. One of them, the owner of a chain of grocery stores, stood up afterward. I like what you're doing, he said. Real numbers, real purpose. He wrote a check on the spot for $10,000. It wasn't much by New York standards, but it was everything to me. When he handed it over, I could barely speak. Linda placed a hand on my shoulder. Someone finally sees what I saw, she said softly. I walked home that evening clutching the envelope like it was made of glass. The city smelled of rain and street food, the kind of scent that feels alive. The subway hummed beneath my feet, and I realized I wasn't scared anymore. Later that night, I climbed up to the roof of my building. The air was cool, the skyline glimmering across the river. From there, Manhattan looked untouchable. Sharp, bright, eternal. I wasn't part of it yet, but I wasn't invisible either. I closed my eyes and breathed in the sound of the city, the chaos and promise of it. One day I would return to that world, not to prove anything to the people who had thrown me away, but to exist on my own terms. Freedom had cost me everything, but standing under that sky, I finally understood. It was worth the price. The first office of Carter Impact Foundation smelled like dust and coffee grounds. It was a narrow second-floor space above a laundromat in downtown Brooklyn, the kind of building that creaked every time the subway passed underneath. The rent was cheap, the paint was peeling, and the air conditioner rattled like it was dying. But to me, it felt like freedom dressed in fluorescent lighting. I had 2 employees. Alex, a 23-year-old communications grad who still believed she could change the world with a PowerPoint deck, and Jason Myers, my new finance manager. Jason was sharp ambitious, and knew his way around a spreadsheet like it was a weapon. He was the kind of man who called himself efficient, but what he really meant was strategic. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me like he was measuring the distance between where he stood and where I sat. Linda officially joined as our senior advisor. She'd stop by once a week with coffee and critiques. You're trying to build Rome overnight, she'd tease. Slow down, impact takes time. She was right, but I couldn't slow down. I didn't want to. I'd spent years surviving. Now I wanted to create. Our mission was simple, fund small projects that gave underrepresented students access to art and education. We started with one scholarship, just one. A local art teacher had emailed us about a student who painted on cardboard because she couldn't afford canvases. That student became our first recipient. When we handed her the grant letter, she cried. I held back tears myself, thinking this is what rebuilding looks like. By the fall of 2019, we were running community events, crowdfunding campaigns, and collaborations with schools. Every new check that came in, every handshake, every thank you note, it was fuel. I was building something from nothing, and I didn't need a family name to do it. Still, that name followed me like a ghost. We decided to host our first fundraising dinner that winter. It wasn't fancy. Rented hall, mismatched chairs, a borrowed sound system. But the energy was alive. I stood at the front with a microphone that cut out every few seconds, talking about transparency, passion, and purpose. I kept my last name abbreviated on all branding: Carter Foundation, I told myself it was for simplicity, but the truth was I was still hiding. After the event, Jason approached me while we were stacking chairs. "You know," he said, leaning casually on a table, "you could raise triple the money if you just owned your last name." I looked at him tired. "Excuse me, the Carter name has history, influence. People recognize it. You don't even have to mention your parents. Just let the name do some of the work." I straightened, feeling my throat tighten. "That name doesn't represent what we're building here," he shrugged. "It's just business, Maddie. Sentiment doesn't pay for programs." I turned away, forcing my tone steady. "If I have to borrow a corrupt legacy to fund good work, then I'm no better than the people who ruined it." Jason raised his hands. "Suit yourself. But idealism doesn't balance a budget." After he left, I stood alone in the empty room, lights flickering overhead, listening to the echo of his words. I thought of my mother, of how she'd said nearly the same thing years ago. "Protect the name, even if it kills you." I smiled bitterly. I was protecting something too, but it was integrity, not reputation. A few months later, I met Oliver Grant at a social impact conference in Midtown. He was giving a talk on sustainable investment using terms I'd only half understood but liked the sound of. When we spoke afterward, he told me he'd read about our community program in a local blog. "You're doing something unusual," he said. "Real change without the ego." We met for coffee a week later. He asked 1,000 questions about my vision, my numbers, my plans for scale. He listened, really listened the way few people ever had. Somewhere between the spreadsheets and the shared sense of purpose, something deeper began to form. Oliver didn't care about the Carter name. He cared about results. He taught me how to pitch investors, how to protect the mission without losing financial structure. When he looked at me, it wasn't pity or curiosity. It was respect. By 2020, Carter Impact had moved to a larger office near Dumbo. The walls were covered in art, donated by scholarship students. We had a proper logo, a small staff, a board of advisors, and enough funding to expand across 3 states. I still rode the subway to work. I still made my own coffee. But for the first time in years, I woke up proud. Then came the first call from a journalist, Ms. Carter. "We're doing a feature on emerging nonprofits in New York. Could we get a photo and a quick quote?" I froze. "No photos," I said quickly. "We keep our focus on the work, not the people." The reporter laughed lightly. "You sound like someone with something to hide." After I hung up, I stared out the window. The skyline shimmered across the river, beautiful and distant. I whispered to myself, I don't want to come back with their name. I want to come back with mine. But fame has a way of creeping in through the cracks you leave unguarded. A small business magazine published a piece about us calling me the mysterious M. Carter, who's redefining philanthropy. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same name that once symbolized scandal was now a mystery people wanted to solve. Jason, of course, loved it. "See," he said, tossing the magazine onto my desk. "Publicity helps." I ignored him, flipping the pages, until my eyes stopped on an image. An old photo republished in the article showing my parents smiling at a gala years ago. They looked perfect, untouchable. Everything I wasn't. The caption read, "The Carter legacy continues to inspire philanthropy across New York." My chest tightened. I closed the magazine, folded it in half, and slid it into my bag. Later that night, alone in the office, I sat by the window, watching lights ripple across the East River. The city had become my accomplice, its noise drowning out the memories I couldn't silence. I whispered to the dark glass. Pain is just energy waiting for direction. And for the first time, I realized I was already turning mine into something unstoppable. By the start of 2022, Carter Impact Foundation had become something I never dared to imagine. A respected name in the city's nonprofit world. Journalists called us the rising star of social impact, and for the first time in years, the word Carter appeared in headlines, without the word scandal next to it. When I walked across the stage at the Midtown Civic Center to accept the Young Humanitarian of the Year award, the applause felt unreal. I smiled for the cameras. Thanked my team, thanked Linda, and thanked everyone who believed in rebuilding trust. What I didn't say was that the recognition scared me. Success draws attention, and attention always came with a cost. After the ceremony, Oliver wrapped his arm around my shoulder as we walked out into the winter air. "You did it, Maddie," he said. "You built something good." I smiled, but part of me waited for the sound of something cracking. A few days later, the first cracks began to show. Jason Myers had become unpredictable, sharp with colleagues, short-tempered in meetings. I'd promoted him to operations director, a role he'd begged for, but the change didn't make him happier. It only made him restless. During board meetings, he'd interrupt Oliver mid-sentence or correct Linda's projections like he was auditioning for a higher stage. One morning, while reviewing donor reports, he muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Funny how you win humanitarian awards while someone else does all the real work." I looked up. "Excuse me." He didn't meet my eyes. "Nothing. Just thinking out loud." Linda later pulled me aside. "Jason's ambitious," she said carefully. "Be kind, but firm. The wrong kind of ambition can rot a good foundation." I nodded, though I didn't want to believe he was capable of anything truly harmful. That night, the office emptied out early after a long week of planning our spring gala. I stayed behind, cleaning up coffee cups and stray papers. When I passed Jason's office, the lights were still on. Through the glass, I saw him hunched over his laptop, typing furiously. He didn't notice me standing there. I almost said goodnight, but something in his posture stopped me, a mix of urgency and guilt. I turned away, telling myself I was imagining things. The next morning, my inbox held an unfamiliar name, Rebecca Lynn. The Observer, New York. Her message was polite but surgical. "Dear Ms. Carter, we've received an anonymous tip suggesting that Carter Impact Foundation may be misreporting donations and partnerships. Before publishing, we'd like to offer you the chance to comment or clarify. Please reply by end of day." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words blurred. I read it twice, 3 times, my hands shaking. My first thought wasn't anger. It was déjà vu. The same nausea I'd felt a decade earlier when my mother accused me of betrayal came rushing back. When Oliver arrived, I showed him the email. He read it in silence, jaw tightening. "This is garbage," he said. "We've got clean books. Someone's trying to rattle you. Or ruin me," I said quietly. Linda joined us later, calm as ever. Setting her coffee on the table. "Don't panic. Don't make statements. Transparency will protect you. Get the lawyers involved. Immediately." We called an emergency meeting. Alex looked confused, flipping through her spreadsheets. "Who would do this?" she asked. No one said Jason's name, but everyone thought it. When I logged into the financial database, the system flagged missing files. Entire donor lists' transaction histories gone. Jason's credentials had been used for the downloads, but his account was already deactivated. His office was empty. I called his phone. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. That evening, Oliver and I drove to his apartment in Williamsburg. His landlord said he'd moved out that morning. "Left a week's rent on the counter," the man said. Didn't seem like he planned on coming back. The betrayal felt physical, like a punch to the ribs. I spent the night at the office surrounded by silence and the soft hum of the building's old radiator. Every keystroke echoed. My thoughts circled the same question. Why? By morning, I filed a formal incident report with our attorney, Ethan Moore, and handed over every trace of Jason's access logs. He promised to handle it quietly while we strengthened internal security. Around noon, an unfamiliar number called my cell. "Ms. Carter. This is Karen Willis with the Internal Revenue Service. I'm reaching out regarding the Carter Family Foundation." The old name hit me like a slap. "That foundation doesn't exist anymore," I said. "It does," she replied calmly. "At least on paper. We've reopened a case concerning their past tax filings, and your name appears in connection to a 2015 transaction. Nothing alarming, yet I'd appreciate your cooperation." The sound of that word, transaction, made my pulse quicken. What kind of cooperation? "Just clarity," she said. "You seem to know how they operated. We'd like to understand what really happened back then." I agreed to meet, though my voice felt detached, like it belonged to someone else. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time. The office around me hummed with quiet productivity, but inside my head it was raining again. The same storm that had followed me the night I left Westchester. Some memories never dry. That evening, when the last of the staff had gone, I finally allowed myself to check my messages. One new text waited from an unknown number. "You can't outrun them, Maddie. The name Carter will always pull you down." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed. The lights outside flickered across the East River, reflecting like broken glass. For the first time since founding the organization, I locked the office door behind me and didn't look back. The IRS building in Lower Manhattan looked like every government office I'd ever imagined. Gray, windowless, and sterile. Even the air inside felt recycled, as if honesty had to pass through metal detectors before it could breathe. Karen Willis met me in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, but calm, with the kind of patience that made people tell her things they hadn't planned to. "Thank you for coming in, Ms. Carter," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "I'm sure this isn't easy. I haven't been part of that foundation in almost 10 years, I said. "There's not much I can tell you." She opened the folder, revealing old tax filings stamped with the Carter Family Foundation letterhead. My mother's signature sat neatly at the bottom of each page. "You were listed as a consultant in 2015. I'd like to know what you did for them." "Nothing," I said. "That was my mother's doing. She used my name without asking." Karen studied me for a long moment. "So you had no role in the financial management?" I tried to ask questions. Once I said quietly. They didn't like that. She closed the file and leaned back. "Look, Ms. Carter, I'm not here to judge your family, but I need context. Money doesn't move itself. If you know something, now's the time to say it." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes left no room for evasion. I took a breath, then told her about the night I found the documents in my father's study, how my mother warned me to stay quiet, how the story twisted until I became the villain. When I finished, Karen nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "That helps." I looked down at my hands. "I don't want revenge if that's what you're thinking. I just want distance." She smiled faintly. "The truth doesn't need your permission to exist. It just needs to be spoken." Something in that line stayed with me long after I left the building. That evening, back in my Brooklyn office, the news was on in the background while I answered emails. My attention drifted when I heard my mother's voice. "After years of rebuilding, the Carter family is proud to announce the New York Charity Auction 2024, the anchor said. The camera cut to Eleanor standing behind a podium, poised and radiant, the perfect image of grace. "Our family has overcome adversity and learned from past mistakes." She said, her tone smooth as silk. "We believe in second chances. For everyone." I froze. Her smile was the same one she used when lying to investors, the same one she wore at every gala, when I was a child, standing in her shadow. My father appeared beside her, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder. They looked untouchable, renewed. For a moment I couldn't move. It had been years since I'd seen them speak publicly, years since I thought their voices could still hurt me. But there it was, the old ache twisting in my chest, sharp as ever. I muted the TV and stared at the silent image of them waving to applause. The words came to me unbidden. I thought I'd outgrown the pain. Turns out it just waited for me to see them again. When Oliver came in, he found me still staring at the screen. "They're really doing it?" he asked. "Apparently redemption sells better than truth," I said. He hesitated. "Do you want me to call someone? The press, maybe?" "No," I said quickly. "I don't need a war." Linda arrived a few minutes later, dropping her umbrella in the corner. She looked at the muted television and shook her head. "Your mother's good at theater," she murmured. "Always was." I exhaled, my voice barely a whisper. "She's rewriting history." Linda turned to me. "Then write yours louder. Sometimes showing up is the only answer they understand." Her words hit me like a challenge I didn't know I was waiting for. That night, I sat in the dim light of my office long after everyone had gone home. I thought about Karen's face at the IRS, the quiet certainty in her voice. The truth doesn't need your permission to exist. I opened my laptop and searched for the event. The official website was polished full of glossy photos and corporate sponsors. At the bottom, a section listed donation tiers, gold, diamond, platinum. My eyes lingered on the last one, Platinum Benefactor minimum contribution, $2,000. I didn't think. I just acted. I opened the foundation's private account, drafted the transfer, and filled in the donor information. Name, Carter Impact Foundation. Contact private. I paused over the confirmation field before typing. The irony of funding their stage wasn't lost on me. Oliver's voice echoed in my head. "You built something good." Linda's followed. "Show up." So I did. The next morning, I told Alex to process the donation paperwork and forward the confirmation email to me directly. "Don't mention it to anyone," I said. "Confidential donor." She blinked. "Even to the board." "Especially not to the board." When she left, I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city. The skyline glowed in the early light, glass towers piercing the fog like exclamation marks. Somewhere in those streets, my parents were preparing their grand return. By noon, the email arrived. "Dear Platinum Benefactor, It read, "We are honored by your generous contribution to the New York charity auction. Your support helps us continue our mission of building brighter futures." I stared at the message for a long time. Honored. The words shimmered on the screen, detached from meaning. My lips curved into something that might have been a smile. The honor was theirs, not mine. I closed the laptop and whispered to the empty room, "Let them celebrate. I'll be there." Outside, the city moved on, as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. The past wasn't finished with me yet. It had simply found a new stage. A week before the auction, the city felt electric. Too bright, too loud, as if it already knew what was coming. Oliver and I sat in my office late one evening, surrounded by folders, invitations, and half-empty coffee cups. The glow from the desk lamp painted his face in tired gold. He leaned back, studying the invitation again. "Platinum Row," he said, tapping the embossed letters, front and center. "Maddie, the cameras will be everywhere. You really think no one's going to notice I met his gaze? If they do, then they do. I'm not hiding anymore." He frowned. "That's not what I'm worried about. You've built something solid. I just don't want this to become a spectacle I finished for him. If it does, that's their doing, not mine." Oliver exhaled slowly, then smiled, soft and resigned. "You really are your mother's opposite. Let's hope so," I said. The invitation had arrived that morning. Thick paper gold trim, my foundation's name printed elegantly under the title Platinum Benefactor. Attached was a VIP badge labeled Platinum Row. I'd run my fingers over the raised ink for a long time, feeling the irony of being publicly anonymous. Later that afternoon, Linda showed up unannounced, carrying a small white box. She placed it on my desk and waited for me to open it. Inside was a silver brooch in the shape of a lily, delicate and understated. "It's beautiful," I said, touching the cool metal. She smiled. "The lily's for renewal. You've carried the past long enough. Let this take its place." "I'm not sure it works like that," I said quietly. "Maybe not," she replied, "but symbols help us remember who we are when the world insists we're someone else." I pinned it to my blazer just to see the way the light caught it. It shimmered faintly like something alive. Linda reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens next, keep your head high. Don't let their noise drown your truth." That evening, I walked through Central Park alone. The last of the winter snow had melted into patches of muddy grass, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Joggers passed me lost in their own worlds. I found a bench near the reservoir and sat watching the city lights flicker through bare trees. The last time I'd seen my parents in person had been years ago, outside a courthouse during the investigation. My mother had walked past reporters like a queen among peasants, chin-lifted pearls gleaming. My father's hand had been on her back, guiding her through the chaos. They hadn't looked at me once. Now they were about to stand on a stage again, reclaiming their empire with charity and champagne. I wondered if they ever thought about that night, about the daughter they'd erased to save themselves. I doubted it. I didn't want them to fall. I didn't want them humiliated. I just wanted them to remember that I had existed, that their silence had consequences. When I got home, the city's noise faded behind the door. My apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I hung my coat, turned on a single lamp, and poured myself a glass of wine. The invitation lay on the counter next to my laptop. I opened the closet and pulled out the black gown I'd bought years ago but never worn. Simple, floor-length sleeveless. I slipped it on and stood in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the scared girl who'd left Westchester in the rain. My hair was pulled back, my posture straight. My face looked calm, controlled, even serene. The silver lily glinted against the black fabric, small but defiant. I turned, slightly studying myself from different angles. For a moment I saw my mother in the tilt of my chin, my father in the set of my shoulders. But where their eyes once held vanity, mine held something quieter, resolve. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, grounding me. Across the city in some penthouse suite, I imagined too clearly. Eleanor Carter was likely rehearsing her speech. I could almost hear her voice. No mistakes this time. Every word must be perfect. And Ava, always the dutiful daughter, probably sat beside her taking notes, nodding. The family's reputation depends on this, my mother would say. I could picture it exactly because I'd lived it. The difference was I no longer belonged in that script. I walked to my desk and set the invitation carefully beside the small reproduction of Portrait of Grace. The photo had faded over the years, the colors softening into sepia, our family in perfect formation. My father's proud stance, my mother's flawless smile, Ava's practiced pose, and me, standing a little off-center, eyes turned toward something outside the frame. I traced my younger self's outline with my fingertip. 10 years ago, I'd left that house under a sky full of rain. 10 years later, I would walk into a ballroom full of light, not to reclaim what was mine, because it never was, but to stand where they could finally see me. I picked up the silver brooch and fastened it to the gown. It gleamed under the lamp, catching the reflection of the city outside my window. Then I whispered almost to myself, "It's time." The hum of traffic drifted faintly from the street below, blending with the pulse of my heartbeat. Somewhere out there, preparations for the auction were already underway. Invitations, mailed guest lists, finalized speeches written. And mine, the silent one, was ready too. I turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in the glow from the window. The invitation and the faded portrait sat side by side on the table, their shadows overlapping in the shape of something new. Tomorrow I would step into their world again, but this time I wouldn't be walking behind anyone. The plaza glittered like a crown under the city lights. Every inch of marble and crystal shimmered, as if New York itself had dressed for the occasion. The red carpet stretched down the grand staircase, and beyond it, a sea of cameras flashed like a storm of tiny suns. Oliver's hand rested gently at the small of my back as we stepped through the entrance. My black gown caught the light in soft ripples, the silver lily pinned just above my heart, gleaming with quiet defiance. The noise of the crowd, the laughter, the practiced charm, it all blended into one long hum. A hostess in a sequined gown checked our passes. "Welcome, Mr. Grant, Miss Carter," she said, glancing at her tablet. "Platinum row seats 7 and 8. She gestured toward the front. As we moved through the golden archway into the ballroom, the magnitude of the event hit me. Chandeliers dripped like frozen rain. Waiters in white gloves glided between tables, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The scent of roses mixed with perfume, sharp and heady. From where I stood, I could see everything. Ava Carter Hughes, my sister, was on the far side of the room, headset on clipboard in hand, commanding the flow of staff like an orchestra conductor. Her blonde hair was pinned high, her movements crisp, professional controlled. She hadn't changed. At the center table sat my parents. My father's silver hair gleamed beneath the lights, his tuxedo immaculate. My mother wore navy silk and a diamond necklace that caught the flash of every camera aimed her way. They looked serene, comfortable in the world that had once shunned them. Watching them talk to reporters, I almost forgot how easily they'd rewritten the story. How skillfully they had replaced shame with spectacle. Oliver leaned close. "Breathe," he whispered. "They have no idea you're here." "I know." My voice was calm. "I'm not here to make a scene." "Then why are you here?" I looked at him. Then at the stage where a banner read New York Charity Auction 2024, Building Futures Together. "To remember," I said, "and to let them feel what it's like to face a truth they can't name." We reached the Platinum row, front and center, only a few feet from the stage. The chairs were upholstered in deep blue velvet, each with a gold embossed nameplate. I smoothed my dress as I sat. From here, I could see every face that had once looked down on me. They were smiling now, radiant in the glow of their own redemption. The MC's voice rang out, full of practiced warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a night of generosity and grace. Tonight we celebrate second chances and the power of giving back." I could almost hear my mother's hand in the phrasing. After the opening remarks, the lights dimmed slightly, and the MC announced, "Please welcome the chairwoman of the Carter Family Foundation, Mrs. Eleanor Carter." Applause thundered through the ballroom. My mother took the stage with her trademark poise, clutching the microphone like a scepter. "Good evening, everyone," she began. 10 years ago, our family faced challenges that tested our faith and commitment, but through resilience and unity, we've rebuilt something even stronger. Tonight, we honor those who have stood by us, and those who continue to believe in hope." Her words floated over the crowd like perfume, sweet but suffocating. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, listening to her claim victory over a history she had buried. 10 years ago, I was the ghost they erased. Tonight, they were thanking me without even knowing it. Cameras panned across the audience, capturing smiling faces. I kept my expression neutral, though the lights from the TV crew burned hot against my skin. Then, without warning, one of the big screens above the stage flickered, and for a split second my face appeared among the Platinum Row guests, just long enough to be seen. Oliver's hand brushed mine under the table. "Stay calm. It's nothing." Across the room, my mother's eyes froze on the screen. Her voice wavered just barely before she steadied herself. My father followed her gaze, scanning the crowd, his brow furrowing. They didn't recognize me, at least not fully, but something unsettled them. I turned to Oliver, lowering my voice. "I don't need them to know who I am," I said. "I just need them to feel the weight of what they've forgotten." The program continued. Speeches, laughter, clinking glasses. A celebrity host cracked a joke that drew polite laughter from the crowd. From my seat, I could see Ava coordinating the cameras, whispering orders to the production team. She looked composed, radiant, her mother's daughter through and through. But when her eyes swept the audience and landed on me, she froze. Just for an instant, her professional mask slipped. Confusion flickered across her face before she quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. "Are you okay?" Oliver murmured. "Perfectly," I said, though my heartbeat was loud in my ears. The lights dimmed again. The auction was about to begin. The MC's voice filled the room. "Before we start tonight's bidding, we'd like to take a moment to recognize the individuals and organizations whose generosity has made this event possible. Please join me in thanking our Platinum Benefactor." The Carter Impact Foundation. A ripple of applause spread through the room, followed by the faint hum of curiosity. I caught the briefest flash of recognition on Ava's face. My mother's smile faltered. Her eyes moved from the stage to the front row, to me. For a moment, everything stopped. The applause faded. The room seemed to hold its breath. My mother's gaze locked on mine, confusion and disbelief warring behind her perfect expression. I held her eyes steadily, offering no smile, no acknowledgement, just quiet presence. Then the spell broke. She blinked, turned back to the crowd, and continued clapping as if nothing had happened. Oliver whispered, "She saw you, I know." I said softly, "And she'll pretend she didn't." The orchestra struck up a tune, glasses clinked, and the crowd resumed its chatter. But across the room, my mother's composure had cracked, if only for a second. I leaned back in my chair, the silver lily glinting under the chandelier, and let the noise of the evening wash over me. They were celebrating redemption. They just didn't realize whose. The chandeliers dimmed to a warm golden glow, and the room hushed with anticipation. The MC stepped back onto the stage, his voice smooth and theatrical. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final piece of the evening, one with deep, sentimental value to the Carter family and to this city's legacy of generosity." On the large screen behind him, a photograph appeared, a familiar oil painting of 4 people posed in front of a grand staircase. My father stood tall, hand resting on my mother's shoulder. Ava smiled perfectly from her spot beside them. And there I was. Off to the left, almost cropped out by the edge of the frame, wearing a white dress I'd long since forgotten, my breath caught, portrait of Grace. The painting had hung in our foyer for as long as I could remember, a monument to everything my parents wanted the world to believe about us. When the scandal broke, they'd sold it quietly to a private collector to cover legal fees. I hadn't seen it in a decade. Eleanor took the stage again, radiant beneath the lights. "This piece," she said, gesturing toward the screen, "was painted by a close family friend. It represents the values we've always held dear. Unity, compassion, and the enduring strength of family." Her voice never wavered, not even when her eyes brushed the image of me in the corner of the painting. She smiled at the audience, her charm seamless. "Tonight, all proceeds will go toward rebuilding arts programs for underprivileged youth." Applause filled the room. I stared at the painting, my chest tightening. Unity, compassion, family. Words that had once meant something to me, now hollow, as the frame that had once hung in our house. The auctioneer stepped forward, tapping his gavel against the podium. "We'll begin the bidding at $500,000. Hands shot up immediately. Numbers rolled off his tongue like music. 50, 600, 650. The crowd leaned in the rhythm of competition, electrifying the air. My glass of champagne felt suddenly heavy in my hand. Oliver sat beside me, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to," he murmured. I kept my eyes on the painting. "I know." The numbers climbed higher. 1 million, someone called from the back. The audience murmured. "Do I have 1.1?" the auctioneer asked. A man in a navy suit raised his paddle. 1.1, 1.2. Another voice answered. 1.2. The auctioneer grinned. 1.3 million. Going once, going twice. My hand lifted before I even realized it. 1.5 million. The room froze. Every head turned. The sound of cameras clicking broke the silence like a drumbeat. The spotlight swung toward the platinum row, and suddenly, I was lit up like an exhibit. Bid of 1.5 million from the Platinum Benefactor. Carter Impact Foundation. The MC announced, excitement returning to his voice. "Do I hear 1.6? No one spoke. Across the ballroom, my mother's hand clenched around her wineglass. My father's jaw tightened. Ava, standing near the production team, stared openly, color draining from her face. Going once, the auctioneer said, his voice echoing. Going twice. Sold. The gavel hit the podium with a sharp crack. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then louder. I sat back, the light still burning on me. My pulse was steady. I didn't smile. I simply lifted my glass and took a slow sip, eyes fixed on the stage. Eleanor leaned toward Ava, whispering, her lips barely moving. "Did you see that Ava's voice trembled? It can't be her. It's impossible. Who else would do something like that?" I felt their eyes on me. Even as they tried to act composed, my mother's public mask slipped just a little. The faintest crack. Oliver's voice was low. "Maddie, everyone's watching." "Good," I said. "Let them." The spotlight lingered a beat too long before shifting back to the stage. The orchestra began to play, filling the air with something light and celebratory. But the energy had changed. The crowd clapped, smiled, whispered. The woman in the black dress on the front row had stolen the night. A photographer's flash went off, then another. Rebecca Lynn was among them, her camera snapping frame after frame, capturing a story she didn't yet understand. My mother tried to regain control. She rose, smiling brightly, lifting her glass. "What a wonderful way to close our evening," she said into the microphone. "We're so grateful to all who've supported the foundation." But her voice wavered. She couldn't stop glancing toward the front of the room. Toward me. I held her gaze calm and unblinking. For the first time in years, she looked unsure of what she was seeing. The auctioneer gestured to the staff to secure the painting now destined for the anonymous Platinum Benefactor. As they carried it off stage, the spotlight brushed over my table once more. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass. 10 years ago, they had erased me from that portrait. Tonight, I had bought it back, not for nostalgia, not for pride, but for closure. I whispered under my breath so softly that only Oliver might have heard. "I'm not buying a painting. I'm reclaiming a silence." My mother's glass slipped slightly in her hand, the red wine trembling near the rim. The camera shutters kept clicking, the sound sharp and relentless. And then, for the briefest second, she faltered. Her posture collapsed just slightly, her shoulders dropping as the realization hit her. I didn't smile. I didn't move. I just sat there under the chandelier's cold light, the silver lily catching the glow, the past and present converging into one perfect, unbearable stillness. When the applause finally faded, I set down my glass. The night wasn't over yet, but something irreversible had already happened. By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It started before dawn, a relentless chorus of notifications, emails, calls. At first, I thought it was fallout from the auction, but then I saw the headline splashed across my screen. The Observer, New York, the truth behind the Carter auction. Rebecca Lynn's article sat at the top of every trending feed. The opening paragraph hit like a punch. The Carter Family Foundation, once a beacon of elite philanthropy, is under renewed investigation by the IRS and the SEC for alleged misuse of charitable funds. Meanwhile, the event's anonymous Platinum Benefactor, revealed to be designer and philanthropist Madeline Carter, donated $2 million to the very family that once disowned her. I sat at my kitchen counter, the city just waking beyond the window traffic humming below. The coffee in my hand went cold as I scrolled through the rest of the article. There was my name, Madeline Carter, 37, founder of Carter Impact Foundation, known for championing transparency in modern philanthropy. My photo, one I'd taken years ago for a small business magazine, now plastered beside words like resilience and redemption. Rebecca's tone was measured but unmistakable. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't pity. She just told the truth. Across the living room, Oliver read from his phone, eyes wide. "You're trending," he said. "Every major outlet's picked it up. NBC, CNN, The Times, everyone." I set my phone down. "They'll twist it by afternoon." He gave me a look. "Maybe. But for once, the truth's on your side." By noon, TV anchors were dissecting every frame from the auction. A clip of me sitting in the Platinum Row played on repeat. A reporter narrated over it. This is the moment Eleanor Carter realized that the mysterious Platinum Benefactor was her own daughter, the one she'd exiled after the 2015 foundation scandal. I watched myself on screen, motionless in that black dress, the silver lily gleaming faintly under the chandelier. It didn't look like revenge. It looked like peace. Reporters interviewed guests from the gala. She didn't even flinch, one man said. That kind of composure. It was powerful. It felt like a movie another woman gushed. She just sat there silent and you could feel the tension. It was poetic. I turned the TV off. Somewhere uptown, I imagined the Carter penthouse in chaos. Ava would be pacing, phone pressed to her ear, her PR instincts failing for once. My father, Robert, would be furious, barking orders, demanding statements lawyers control. And my mother, she'd be quiet. That was her way when the facade cracked, silent, calculating, trying to shape the narrative before it slipped away. Around lunchtime, Linda called. "You should eat," she said first thing. "Then turn off your phone for a while. I can't. There's too much. There's nothing you can do right now that the truth isn't already doing for you." She interrupted gently. "Let it breathe." Her words settled into me like a steadying hand. By late afternoon, the first exclusive broke on cable news. A reporter stood in front of the Carter building, whined, tugging at her hair. Sources close to the investigation confirm that the IRS has reopened the Carter Family Foundation's records following new evidence of misused donor funds. Investigators believe these transactions predate the 2015 scandal, suggesting a pattern of financial misconduct. A spokesperson declined to comment. Then she added, "Madeline Carter could not be reached for comment." That line repeated itself across every outlet by evening. My phone rang until the battery died. Oliver sat across from me at the kitchen table, the air thick with the quiet before night. "You could hold a press conference," he said softly. "Control the story." I shook my head. "No, the story's already written." He frowned. "You don't want to defend yourself." "There's nothing to defend," I said. "I didn't accuse them. I didn't expose anything. I just showed up. The rest is their truth catching up." He reached across the table and took my hand. "You really believe that's enough?" I met his eyes. "I do." At that same moment, somewhere uptown, my family was unraveling. I could picture the scene as clearly as if I'd been there. Ava, at the kitchen counter, hands trembling as she unfolded the morning paper. Her voice cracking when she said, "Mom, she's in the news." My father snatching it from her, scanning the headline, his fist slamming the table. She humiliated us, in front of everyone. And my mother's voice softer than I'd ever known it. "No, she didn't do this to us. We did it to ourselves." That night, Rebecca Lynn sent me an email. "I owe you an apology," she wrote. "I was the one who questioned your transparency last year after Jason Myers reached out with those documents. He's now under federal review for falsifying reports. I should have trusted the work you were doing. For what it's worth, your composure last night. There's a story in that, too. Thank you for letting the rest of us see what integrity looks like in real time." I stared at the message for a long moment before replying simply, "Thank you for writing the truth." It was close to midnight when my phone buzzed again. This time a single text from an unknown number. "Justice moves slowly, but it moves. Karen Willis." I read it twice, then turned the phone face down on the table. The city outside my window pulsed with the rhythm of traffic and nightlife, bright and indifferent. For the first time in a long time, I felt still. Justice doesn't need applause. It doesn't care for cameras or headlines. It moves at its own pace, in its own way. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the quiet settle around me. Somewhere in the city, people were whispering my name, half in admiration, half in disbelief. But none of it mattered. The truth didn't need an audience. It only needed time. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of my Brooklyn office, spilling across the wooden floor in long, golden streaks. Outside, the city hummed faintly. Muted traffic, a siren in the distance, a rhythm I'd learned to live by. Inside, everything was still. On the far wall hung the painting I'd once thought I'd never see again. Portrait of Grace. The colors looked softer now than I remembered. Time had dulled the varnish, mellowing the whites into cream, and the golds into honey. I'd hung it there a week earlier, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the most painful things can lose their sharpness. The soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. "Come in," I said. The door opened slowly. Eleanor Carter stood framed in the doorway. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her posture, once immaculate, was curved slightly inward, her movements hesitant. The pearls she always wore were gone. In their place hung a simple silver chain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Hello, Mother," I said quietly. Her eyes flicked toward the painting on the wall, then back to me. "You hung it." "It seemed wrong to let it sit in storage," I replied. She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "It's strange," she murmured. "I used to think that painting was proof of who we were, our strength, our unity. Now it just reminds me of what I refused to see. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the city outside. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit." Eleanor lowered herself into the seat slowly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I could see the faint tremor in her fingers. "This place," she said after a moment, looking around the office. "You built it yourself." "With help," I said. "But yes, from the ground up." Her eyes caught on the logo printed on the glass door. "Carter Impact Foundation," she smiled faintly, almost painfully. "You kept the name." "For the right reasons this time," I said. Her throat moved as she swallowed. "You've done what I couldn't, created something honest." I shook my head. "I didn't do it to be better than anyone. I just wanted to do what was right." Her eyes glistened. "I know," she whispered, "and that's what makes it hurt so much." She looked away, staring at the sunlight fading across the floor. When the story broke, she said softly, "I told myself I'd done everything for the family, to protect our legacy, but what I really protected was my fear. I was so terrified of losing control, of being judged, that I let everything else go, including you. I didn't speak. There was nothing I could add that wouldn't sound small next to that admission." Her gaze lifted, and for the first time in years I saw the mother I remembered. The one who used to tuck my hair behind my ear before every recital, the one who hummed when she cooked Sunday breakfast. "I was wrong, Maddie," she said, voice cracking. "I was wrong about everything." I met her eyes. "You don't need to apologize," I said gently. "Forgiveness doesn't need words. It needs truth." She pressed her lips together, fighting to hold steady. "I don't expect you to forget. I just wanted to say it out loud so it wouldn't rot inside me anymore." I nodded once. "That's enough." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, the kind used for legal documents. The paper looked thick and formal, sealed with an embossed stamp. "I wanted to give you this," she said, sliding it across the desk. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a signed transfer of ownership, the official deed to the Portrait of Grace. "The painting belongs to your foundation now," she said quietly. "To you. To the people who still believe in what you're doing." For a moment I couldn't speak. I looked at her, at the woman who had built a kingdom out of perfection and fear, now sitting in front of me, stripped of both. "Thank you," I finally said. She nodded, eyes damp. It's time it stood for something real. She rose slowly, her hands resting on the edge of the desk to steady herself. When she came around to my side, I stood too. For a moment, we just stood there. Two Carters separated by a decade of silence and one fragile truth. Then she reached out and placed a trembling hand on my shoulder. The gesture was light tentative, as if she wasn't sure she still had the right. I didn't move away. Her eyes searched mine. "You've changed," she said softly. "So have you." I replied. She smiled small and sad. "Not enough." The sunlight caught the silver chain at her neck as she turned toward the door. Her reflection passed across the glass where the foundation's name was etched, and for a second she paused. "I hope you find peace, Maddie," she said. "I already have," I whispered. She nodded once, then walked out, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall until there was only silence. I stood there for a long time, the late light fading from gold to amber. The painting on the wall glowed softly in the dimming sun. I looked up at it, at the frozen smiles, the old ghosts, and felt no anger, no triumph, only stillness. My mother had come to return what she thought she'd taken from me, but the truth was she couldn't have stolen it in the first place. Peace isn't something anyone can take. It's something you learn to keep. A week later, the news broke like thunder across every network. The headlines scrolled across the bottom of every screen. Former Carter Foundation executives indicted for fraud and misuse of charitable funds. The footage was relentless. Federal cars outside the courthouse, cameras, flashing microphones crowding the steps. I watched from my office, the muted television flickering in the corner as the story unfolded. Robert and Eleanor Carter face multiple charges of financial misconduct. The anchor announced, her tone clipped but almost reverent, as if even justice was wary of tarnishing old money. Court documents allege a decade-long scheme involving falsified donations and embezzled grants. The couple faces millions in fines and possible prison time. The clip cut to footage of my mother outside the courthouse, flanked by attorneys. She didn't hide this time. Her hair was pulled back, no diamonds, no designer scarf, just a gray coat and tired eyes. When reporters called her name, she didn't turn away. She simply lowered her head, accepting the storm she'd once thought she could control. Ava appeared briefly in the footage too, leaving her office surrounded by cameras. Her voice trembled as she told reporters, "I had no knowledge of the transactions. My only hope is that the truth comes out." Within hours, every major firm she'd worked with severed ties. The family name that once opened doors now closed them just as fast. I sat at my desk, the afternoon sun cutting across the floor. Oliver leaned against the window, watching me instead of the screen. Linda sat across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When the anchor announced the charges again, Linda exhaled softly. "It's strange," she said. "We chase justice for years, and when it finally arrives, it doesn't roar. It whispers." Oliver nodded. "And sometimes it doesn't fix anything. It just ends the noise." I looked at the muted screen again. My father's profile filled the frame. Still proud, still refusing to look small even in handcuffs. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel pity either. Just clarity. Linda's voice was gentle. "You don't need to say anything, Maddie. Sometimes silence is the loudest statement you can make." I smiled faintly. "That's all I've ever had. Silence." She reached out and touched my hand. "Then make it mean something." Later that afternoon, a delivery arrived. A letter hand-delivered, my name written neatly in dark ink. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Rebecca Lynn. Inside a single page. "I hope you understand that my article wasn't about exposing them. It was about honoring you. You reminded me that integrity doesn't need to shout. It just needs to endure." I read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it beside the framed portrait of Grace. The painting caught the fading light, the faces inside frozen in time. I traced my younger self's outline again the same way I had that night before the auction. For years, I thought justice meant hearing them say sorry. Now I knew better. Justice didn't need an apology. It only needed the truth to stand on its own again. By early evening, the news anchors had moved on to the next scandal, the next celebrity meltdown, the next wave of distraction. But inside my office, the story wasn't finished yet. I looked up at Oliver and Linda. "I'm calling a press meeting," I said quietly. Oliver frowned. "I thought you didn't want attention." "I don't," I said. "But I want to give something back, something that doesn't carry their weight anymore." The next morning, the small conference room of the Carter Impact Foundation was filled with reporters. The cameras weren't as aggressive as the ones that used to follow my parents, but they were ready, curious, cautious. I stood at the podium, a row of microphones in front of me, the portrait of Grace visible on the wall behind me. "Thank you for coming," I began. My voice didn't shake. "You all know the story by now. My family name has been in the headlines again, but this time, not for the reasons anyone hoped. I can't change what's been done, but I can decide what happens next." The room fell silent. This painting behind me, once a symbol of status, is now property of the Carter Impact Foundation. Its appraised value, $1.5 million, will fund a new initiative for ethics in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. I paused, meeting their eyes. The program will be called the Eleanor Initiative for Integrity. It will support students who want to learn how to build transparency into every level of social work and charitable development. Cameras flashed, questions started to rise, but I lifted a hand gently to quiet them. This isn't about forgiveness or revenge, I said. It's about transformation, about letting what was broken become useful again. Linda smiled faintly from the front row. Oliver stood beside her, his expression a mixture of pride and quiet awe. I looked toward the window, the city sprawling beyond the glass, and for the first time in years, I felt like the name Carter didn't belong to the past anymore. It belonged to the future. When the reporters left and the room emptied out, I stayed behind. The late afternoon light fell over the podium and onto the painting. The faces in it seemed softer somehow, the edges less defined. I whispered to the empty room, "Let this be the ending it deserves." And for once, it truly felt like one. 3 months later, the city had softened into summer. The skyline shimmered under the night. Every window in Manhattan lit like a heartbeat. From the rooftop bar of the Whitmore, the view stretched endlessly. Bridges, rivers, streets that never slept. I stood with a glass of champagne in hand, surrounded by the people who'd stayed when everything else fell apart. The Carter Impact team had insisted on hosting a celebration, not a gala, not a press event, just friends, family of choice. The sound of jazz drifted from a small band in the corner, low and mellow. Candles flickered on every table, the kind of soft light that made even old scars look golden. Linda lifted her glass first. To Maddie, she said, voice steady but warm. "The only woman I know who managed to create justice without ever stepping into a courtroom." Laughter rippled around us, but beneath it was something deeper, respect. Oliver grinned beside her, his tie already loose, his glass half empty. "Speaking of courtrooms," he said, glancing my way, "theirs starts next week. You thinking of going?" I swirled my drink, watching the city lights refract through the glass. "No," I said softly. "They don't need me there. They'll have to face themselves, and that's harder than facing me." Linda nodded approvingly. "Spoken like someone who's finally learned to let go, maybe," I said. Or maybe I just learned that closure doesn't require witnesses. A breeze picked up, tugging gently at my hair. Across the rooftop, the team had gathered in small groups. Alex laughing with a donor, our interns snapping selfies, the kind of joy that feels earned. Someone called out to gather everyone for a photo. "Come on, Maddie." Alex waved me over. "You have to be in this one." I joined them, slipping into the center. The photographer counted down, and for a moment I let myself smile. Not the practiced kind, but the real one. The flash went off, freezing us in that instant. The foundation, the people who believed the proof that something good had come from all the ruin. As the group broke apart, I drifted toward the railing, drawn by the pull of the skyline. The wind was cooler here, carrying the hum of the city below. Across the river, the old Carter Foundation building stood in silence, its grand facade dark except for one small sign taped to the glass doors. Closed by IRS order. I stared at it for a long moment, not with triumph, not even sadness, just acknowledgement. It was strange how endings rarely arrived with fanfare. They just settled. 10 years ago, they erased me from their family. Tonight, I didn't need to be written back in. I had already authored my own ending. Oliver joined me at the railing, setting down his drink. "You okay?" "I am," I said, watching the reflection of the city ripple against the river. "It's strange, though. For so long, I thought revenge would feel loud, but it doesn't. It feels quiet, like breathing after holding it for years." He smiled. "That's how you know it's peace, not payback." Behind us, Linda was laughing with the others, telling some story that made the whole table erupt. Music swelled again, the saxophone dipping into something soft and wistful. I turned back to the view. The city looked endless, infinite possibilities stretching beyond every rooftop. "I think I'm finally done chasing ghosts," I said. Oliver leaned on the railing beside me. "You didn't chase them, Maddie. You just stopped letting them haunt you." The air smelled faintly of rain and summer flowers from a nearby garden terrace. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. The noise, the laughter, the freedom of it all. When I opened them again, I felt lighter. As the night wound down, I stayed behind while everyone said their goodbyes. One by one, they drifted toward the elevator voices, fading until only the city's pulse remained. I stepped closer to the edge, my heels clicking softly against the stone. The glass railing reflected the skyline back at me, 1,000 small lights scattered across the dark like pieces of something once broken, now shining again. The wind caught the ends of my hair, lifted them gently. Somewhere below, a cab honked, a siren wailed, a song changed. Sometimes silence says everything words can't. That night, surrounded by laughter fading into the hum of the city, I realized the most expensive revenge I'd ever taken was peace itself. I set my glass down the condensation, leaving a perfect ring on the table. Then, I whispered barely louder than the breeze. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. And in that stillness, above the city that once watched me fall and now watched me rise, I finally understood. My silence had never been weakness. It had been my power all along. So when the final applause of the night died down, and the lights of Manhattan blinked like distant stars, I smiled. Because sometimes the most perfect revenge is simply living in peace so completely that the world has no choice but to listen. Have you ever stayed silent long enough for someone to finally hear you? That was my story. What's yours?